Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's always my pleasure to be on your program.
Charles, as with the beginning of every new year, we usually share our thinking on the key themes we expect to be focused on throughout the unfolding year. As such, I have our agenda up on the screen here on what we're going to talk about this morning, but any comments before we jump into your 7 key themes for 2018?
No, I'm delighted to lay out a roadmap that we'll be referring to as the year unfolds.
Charles, your first theme on social change, we actually just completed a 3-part series. And I say that for some of our listeners who may not have just had a chance to review it. And I have the outline of that series up now, so I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on it. I refer, again, our listeners to the video series at Macro Analytics. But any comments you'd like to make before we proceed to your second theme?
No, I think that's the 3 programs. I think we covered everything that we foresee happening in the social disorder space.
We're going to come back to that, Charles, when I attempt to map them in a process called abstraction. So we'll just leave them, the social changes here for a second. But I have up the first set of your themes.
The first on this slide are the populism, policy extremes, and decay of trust. And of course, these are all related in my mind to the decay of the centralized mechanisms of governance that were successful in the latter half of the 20th century, but here in the 21st century, they're failing, and their failure in terms of like enabling social mobility, of lessening wealth and income inequality instead of expanding it. Giving people a sense that they have a stake in this system. All these things are decaying, and so we see the rise of populism, not just in the U.S., but around the world in various forms. And in response to the public dissatisfaction with the failure of the status quo, then the centralized powers that be are pushing policies to further and further extremes. And we've often talked about the monetary policy extremes, but they're also pushing fiscal and tax policies to extremes and trying to control the system that's fraying. And then their sort of repression, if you will, of populism and discontent, or they're ignoring it and glossing it over with phony statistics and so on, has led to a decay of trust. We no longer trust the authorities to do the right thing for society as a whole. We don't trust our institutions, which are now filled with self-serving elites and insiders. And we don't trust the statistics, the data that's being presented as actually accurate. So, and then my last 3 points are decentralization, alternative banking, and the reversal of the business and credit cycles. And of course, technology is a disruptor, right? And it's been a disruptor for millennia. And in the current 4th industrial revolution, the forces of software, AI, 3D fabrication, cryptocurrencies, all these innovations enable decentralization. We no longer need a centralized authority to tell us how to do something or to control the production of goods and services. And that's disrupting the sort of skim, if you will, of all the insiders and elites who control the centralized systems in our society. And then that one of the outshoots of technology is alternative banking. And this includes peer-to-peer lending, fundraising from the public as opposed to doing a venture capital managed process, and the hope of many people that cryptocurrencies will provide a banking system that's peer-to-peer, decentralized, and outside the control of central banks. And then my last point is we're really in the ninth inning of this very weak, very tepid, very manipulated recovery, or whatever you want to call it. And nothing lasts forever. And no matter what your monetary policies, there are cycles of business and credit expansion and contraction. And we're at the last stage of that. And when that finally rolls over, as it should, and sets up the next cycle of growth, that's going to add further pressure on an already stressed system of finance and governance.
Good list. It's amazing how many of these themes map into some of the work that we've done at MATA SII. But your number 4, Decay of Trust. We wrote a major paper, our thesis 2016. We called it Crisis of Trust versus the Decay in Trust. Talk to a lot of these things, a lot of the points that you're raising here, which is saying that they're unfolding and unfolding at a fairly significant and much larger extent. And what the other thing is that really jumps out to me is this is change trying to happen. The impediments and the roadblocks that seem to be being put in place by the status quo to stop things from happening, or they just don't know how to make them unfold in some kind of controlled and logical fashion. Charles, let me just show you some of the themes that we have. And I put out a paper. I have up here our 2018 thesis paper, which was called New World Order. And on the right-hand side, themes and where they were leading to. And listeners can read the list here. But they range from a major transition that we see going from a unipolar world, United States so dominant, to a multipolar world. And that's already happening in a significant way. De-dollarization. And I'm not talking about just reserve currency. I'm talking about the use of the dollar in as many dollars needed in terms of global trade, because we don't do as much trade as a percentage of the global trade as before, and what that's going to mean. Massive changes in demographics, which are now really unfolding. We're at some major cusps. Yeah, and big reversal, which you and I did a whole show on. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you can read through them, but inequality, you've been talking about that for quite some time, and elements of that inequality, and in the whole shift in capitalism to creditism and what that really means in many ways regarding international banking, where accounting has become archaic, was based on an industrial model of goods and services, and what's happened today is we're running a creditism system, and how accounting is done, and how assets have become a debt has become an asset, and how it's put onto ledgers between banks, between countries, and how money is now created, and it's no longer controlled by the central banks, or even to that degree the shadow banks. So anyway, those I don't want to spend a lot of time on. I encourage our listeners to go to MATA SI, get the document, and can read up on how we looked at each of those themes. Quite a number of them are a little different than yours, but maybe more important is the methodology, Charles, that we use to come up with our thesis each year. And it's something we call a process of abstraction. And it's a very mechanical, very disciplined approach, because there's so much news and noise and clutter coming at you. And I don't know, you and I both probably see 150 articles a day. And, best we can do is even scan the bulk of them if we can do that. But how do you distill that? And this process has been very, very effective for us. And basically, the little colored boxes on the left-hand side are where we pick tipping points. And we have 44 tipping points that we track at MATA SII. But the tipping points aren't necessarily the important part. It's trying to figure out what those tipping points, when you group them together and pick what maybe 3 or 5 of them are pointing us at. That's the abstraction column. And then try and take those abstraction blocks and synthesize and say, well, what's it suggesting? And that suggestion is usually not in the news. It's not something people are talking about. It hasn't unfolded yet. But if you really went through this process, you can start to get pretty good at guessing what it might be. And the proof is in the pudding, in that we've been doing these officially in the public domain since 2000. And on the right are the thesis papers that came out of it. And you can see on the bottom this year, New World Order. And this methodology forced us, we didn't just choose to write them, it forced us to write on subjects. And the big point here is that in every case, we were 2 years or 3 years ahead of items that became major themes later on. You're always too early with these things, always. But at least you start to allow yourself, we believe, to build our investment thesis as we go through that methodology. And one of the things I wanted to do is to play around with your themes, and I did, to try and figure out where does it possibly fit in our new themes as we go into the 2019 build. Any comments or questions on any of that, Charles? Sorry to be long-winded, but
I'm just looking at your slide here of your annual thesis process, and where you list the 9 or 10 themes that you've covered in the past. And what's striking to me is that you were a few years early, but each of your themes continues to be a dynamic, and that these are, and what we're really doing, and we've spoken about this in the past, is each of these dynamics is adding another layer of stress on the system. So if we look back in 2011, you wrote about currency wars. Well, those aren't over. That didn't end in 2011. It simply got to be a hot currency war, and it's still going on. Financial repression, it's still as yet unfolding. Statism, that's still working. Globalization has not been resolved. It's still an issue. Fiduciary failure, crisis of trust, illusion of growth, all of these are still functioning dynamics. And so that's partly why what we're trying to do here is explain that all these mechanisms and areas of decay are working together, if you will, and putting even more stress on the system. So it's not simply one problem that then gets resolved and then the system moves to another problem. It hasn't solved any of these problems. And that's what's striking.
That is precisely it. None of the problems are being solved. We can call it kick the can down the road. They're being allowed to fester and become larger, and then become and the system to become more complex and more fragile because they start to overlap, and clearly they are. And the easiest way to see that is, in our tipping points, when we first, I've been doing these since pre-2007 financial crisis. We actually had a site called Tipping Points, and the numbers were quite small. We had 10, 12, 15. Well, last year we went in with 33 of them. And we said, this is starting to get out of control. I mean, just so many of them, and we can't take any off because they're still serious and they're still there. Well, we're starting the year now, Charles, with 44 on this current list. and I got a slide here to put some meat onto our discussion, and where I said I'm mapping your themes. And I apologize how small it is here, but we'll get to it in a little larger illustration in a second. But for example, social change, your number one, we got 5 different tipping points that are all just part of that social change that have already been built in. Inequality, global governance failure, the lack of leadership, call it populism if you want, growing social unrest just in itself, a gutted working middle class and how the social contract is breaking down, pension crisis and pension entitlement crisis, which is looming in front of us, all part of this, the social change in the social fabric, how it's going. And again, that's just on the one item there. Comments on that?
Yeah, it's I applaud you for laying this out in a systemic fashion. And later in the program, we'll touch on a slide that you prepared here of the what I would consider the large context. And there's these major contextual problems in the global economy that you can't solve with policy tweaks or some sort of little monetary magic. And we're talking about global deflationary pressures and chronic underemployment. And so, I just wanted to bring up that slide because as we look at my themes list, these are really the manifestations of profound systemic problems such as deflation and chronic unemployment and chronic inequality. And so what we're doing is we're basically listing the manifestations that come to the surface, if you will, from the decay of these much larger dynamics.
At the end of the financial crisis, I shouldn't say at the end of it, as we thought it was ending, in 2007, 2008, we put this chart together on where we felt we were going, and it was that we would move from financial problems, which it was centric, and domestic, which the U.S. So the financial crisis was primarily a U.S. Housing financing crisis, though it had spillage in a much larger fashion, but that we would move from financial to economic to political over the next, we weren't quite sure what period, but we saw it being out into 2018, 2020. And at the same time, the issues would move from domestic to regional to global, and we saw that unfold as we went from the domestic problem in the United States, the financial crisis, to the EU banking crisis in 2012. So we're in an era now, and it shows in all of the themes, the issues that the political element on a global basis, and as you correctly point out, these are major systemic issues that have not been addressed, and overlap is where we're now at. And when I'm showing this chart with your themes, and I've taken this little red area so we can blow it up a little bit larger, where it's showing, your number 2, 4, 6, 5th, and 3rd theme and how it maps into our charts. Ours is much more detailed than this. I just wanted to really focus on yours. But you see how many of yours are political. So as averse to economic and financial, it's not to say that there aren't a lot of issues there, but the issues have become political. And if you start to connect those, they're leading us to, as you also say, policy extremes, but into a whole destabilization of the status quo, which leads us to a new world order. And so that's the kind of the game we're playing. And yours are pointing us in exactly, it was amazing how well it fit into our new world order discussion. I saw them because we were preparing for it, and I thought, boy, those really map quite well with our conclusions separately. This next chart, you can see the red box is much larger, and I'm trying to connect all of your points here, and it's leading to a fiat currency, and you can see the destabilization of the status quo, but it leads to this new world order. And it's not like this is frozen. Things will continue to unfold through the course of the year, and some of these things will become much clearer. I think that we're going to see employment crisis of a huge proportion becoming much bigger, even though we listen to all these fabricated labor numbers, and that's a whole discussion in itself. But the 3 boxes here, employment crisis, a big reversal, and trade conflicts and protectionism, right now I think yours are pointing us towards. And certainly all of ours are. And for example, just to again put a little more meat on it, this chart shows you some of the things that we're looking at when I say we've got an employment crisis problem. And I know that 99 out of 100 Americans that have jobs would say that's bull because the numbers have never been lower. But those 94 million people who are not participating in the labor force, those 52, now 46 million on food stamps, only because we reduced who qualified for food stamps. The almost 1 million people that are literally homeless, I think the number is 650,000, and 41 million people that are below the poverty line, they would argue completely different. But this chart here is showing that the World Bank is saying we're going to need 600 million new jobs in the next 10 years globally. 600 million. Just think of the new emerging markets that are now able to produce goods and services, have a relatively growing educational base and skill set, who can be labor arbitrage. China's going to robotics. It's already went to the labor is down in Vietnam. It's even moving from Vietnam as it moves down. But we need 600 million jobs. And what is a major point here, if that's not bad enough, because we have no idea how to do that, the World Bank was very clear when they put out their number, they said, we don't know how to size what robotics is going to do. We just have no way of really putting our hands around the size of it. And I just finished reading a very detailed report by the McKinsey company on robotics. And they're saying it's going to be there's another 400 to 800 million jobs that by 2030 are going to be replaced by robotics. It's only the beginning. And it's staggering. And the bottom line when you get into them is you can't think of robotics in the way we traditionally. You have to understand that it's traditional robotics married to the internet with the intelligence that comes from the internet, married to artificial intelligence, which then delivers in facial recognition, where the robotics can actually identify the person that's in front of them and the object that's in front of them and what that means, and then with artificial intelligence do something. It will reinvent retail, and Amazon knows it. It will reinvent, the same as the internet, remove secretaries, clerks, filing clerks, words we don't even use anymore that were part of my era. There's another wave that's coming. And we're not geared for this as a country. And you and I kind of touched on it, our discussion in social change about guaranteed income that's starting to unfold. Anyway, a little long-winded. Any comments so far on that, Charles, that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I think you've touched on something that I want to elaborate a bit on, and my latest book, which I will pitch only because it's relevant to this particular topic we're discussing of jobs and work and the impact of the fourth industrial revolution. My book is called Money and Work Unchained, and I'm basically making the case that we need a whole new social order. We need a new social system because the current social system is not going to function with the kind of economy that we're having for all the reasons you just described. And so we're going to have to reorganize the way we live and work and do business, and to adapt successfully to the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. And so I just want to make a larger point here, sort of my end cap to the discussion is I'm reading a book now, as you probably know, I'm very interested in studying the previous empires that humans have created, and the collapse of those empires. And I'm reading a book about the Sung Dynasty in China, with circa 1250, 1275 AD. And it reminds me so powerfully of all the other dynasties that decayed, weakened, and then collapsed, either from internal discord or from being conquered by an outside force or other forces of collapse. And the dynamic is always the same, as far as I can tell, which is a system thrives because it allows its entire populace to have a stake in the system, and people feel like they can advance their own interests and the interests of their family. And at the decay stage, all the wealth of the system is being skimmed off by insiders and elites, and there's just not enough left to go around. And then all the systems of decay and production decay because all the wealth's being skimmed, and corruption is endemic. And so I think that describes the United States of America today. Most of the wealth is being skimmed by insiders and elites. The system of governance is totally corrupt. It's pay to play. Wealth casts the only votes that count. And this is corrupting and destabilizing the forces of production. In other words, now we have a system that's ruled by malinvestment, and all the policy extremes are creating perverse incentives that are filtering throughout the whole system. And so we're in a stage of decay because the powers that be are clinging on to their old models. And this is exactly what happened in the Tang Dynasty and the Sung Dynasty and the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. Is the insiders and elites who are benefiting from this system that's no longer functioning will cling to it to the last second, instead of allowing the change that's happening to unfold. And as you said earlier in the program, change is trying to happen, and they're resisting it and creating obstacles. And that's why we're going to have a collapse, because there's no other way to transition. If you're going to resist change, then change will steamroll you eventually.
I'm with you 100%. Very well articulated, Charles. I may not want to use the word collapse, though there's going to be some ugliness involved. There always is in change, or there would be no change. But I do think we're in the process of a major transition. But on the other side of it, there will be a much better world that is more responsive to the needs of everybody in the world, not just the developed nations who've had the lion's share of it, not just elitists right now, because we're living in a new gilded age. And you and I did all sorts of shows on crony capitalism, actually 3-4 years ago. And how our concerns were there, and now we've seen it taken to such a degree when we look at the statistics on inequality that's going on in America. So said, well, Charles, I apologize, I took a little too long in employment, but there were two others that your charts were leading us to, and that was this coming big reversal, the bottom line. And we have videos up in Macro Analytics where we actually talk about a show on the big reversal as part of financialization, and that is savings are not going to be large enough to support the savings growth rate. Is not going to be large enough to support the investment growth rate of the size of the debt and what that's going to mean to yields and what longer term. And then the last one is some of the protectionists. This is like 1930s, where we got into trade and currency wars. And when Trump talks, and I'm not picking on Trump here, but his fair trade versus free trade is being translated around the world as the first salvo of trade wars, the same as we had with the Smoot-Hawley in 1930, which led us into the Depression. I'm not saying that's necessarily going to happen, but these are the kinds of themes that are really starting to unfold, and you can see the blocks that have built up on it. A little disjointed there. I apologize to our listeners, but any other comments you'd like to make here, Charles, as we wrap up?
Yeah, just the process that you described, the coming big reversal, is basically it's the systems that are no longer functioning properly and not serving society and the economy as a whole are being pushed to extremes, and then they're failing in new ways. And so we're doing more of what's already failed, and that's basically why we're going to have a big reversal. But we covered a lot of ground, and I would just kind of leave listeners with the idea of review Gordon's entire list, which is well organized, and that's what we're going to be focusing on going forward.
A lot of this is at MetaSII or at Macro Analytics, our YouTube channels, whether in video form, written form, in terms of our work, thesis. But you've also are doing a lot of work. Do you want to tell our listeners, Charles, how they could follow some of your work on this subject?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com, and you can read the first 36 pages of my new book for free. There's a PDF you can download in a few seconds and see what I'm thinking about.
Charles, thank you for your time. I know you're in Hawaii and it's beautiful. I just need to tell you that I'm in the middle of a snowstorm here in Boston. And on this happy note, talk to you next month.
Okay, thanks so much, Gordon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.